Good evening, everyone. My name is Rajiv Guha, and I'm a program director at the James Irvine Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this important conversation on rebuilding after disaster. It's exciting to see such a diverse audience of students, scholars, practitioners, folks who work in public agencies, and community members here at the Faculty Club. And if you're anything like me, what brings you here today is an interest in understanding how to center equity and deepen community resilience in how we respond to the kinds of climate-related disasters we've seen in recent years in different parts of our state, including most recently in Los Angeles, where I happen to live. Tonight's event was made possible through a unique partnership between the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, the Othering and Belonging Institute, and the California Policy Lab. 3 distinguished research centers housed on this very campus, each working on distinct but interrelated aspects of the housing and homelessness crisis facing our state. This event is the first public dialogue jointly organized by these 3 centers, and it represents their commitment to collaboration and research and community engagement, and to start de-siloing areas of research silos that have existed for a long time. At the Irvine Foundation, we're proud to support this collaboration because the singular goal that drives our work is a California where all low-income workers and their families have the power to advance economically. And what we know is that this goal is increasingly out of reach. The cost of living in our state is rising faster than wages. Low-income and middle-class families are being displaced further and further inland and often out of state. And the increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related events has exacerbated housing insecurity, making it more difficult for many to find safe and affordable homes. We also know that climate disasters do not affect all communities equally. Low-income neighborhoods and communities of color often bear the brunt of these events, facing greater risks and longer recovery times. Moreover, the remaining neighborhoods in California where working-class families can afford to buy a starter home are often those most at risk of climate-related risks in the future. Sorry, my finger slipped there. So this demands our action and our attention. However, we must also acknowledge the tension between addressing the immediate needs of families impacted by climate-related disasters and the long-term realities faced by our communities. This morning, I was in Altadena. I flew up to see you all today. And Altadena is a place where government and civic institutions are rallying to try to provide urgent assistance to help families rebuild their lives. But does a just recovery mean helping people rebuild exactly what was there before? Or is it an opportunity to imagine a more sustainable and resilient community? This evening, I'm thinking about my friends and colleagues in Altadena and in the Palisades who are struggling to figure out whether and how to rebuild their homes. I'm thinking about the day laborers and domestic workers who experience dangerous and unhealthy conditions during and after the wildfires as de facto first responders. I'm thinking about residents who've already been displaced to other cities. They may have enrolled their kids in new schools and may never be able to return. And I'm thinking about the scientists and activists who warned us that disasters like this were inevitable. And I'm wondering, what is the role of the state in all of this, of local government, of community voice? Whose interests should be centered in key decisions about rebuilding? And what interests will likely be centered instead if we're not vigilant as a society? These aren't easy questions. Unfortunately for all of you, it's not my job today to try to answer them. Instead, we're going to be happy to pass the floor to our esteemed guests who are going to share their perspectives on these questions and others, although they might not be able to get to all of them today. So thank you to you for attending. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their perspectives. And thank you to the brilliant teams at the Terner Center, OBI, and the California Policy Lab who've worked hard to organize this important collaborative event. I'm now going to pass to our colleague Nicole from OBI.
Thank you, Rajiv, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nicole Montojo, and I'm a housing researcher at the Othering and Belonging Institute here on campus. And before we bring up our speakers, I'd like to ask us just to pause and acknowledge the gravity of what we're here to discuss today. This evening, we're talking about rebuilding after disaster, but the reality is that when disaster comes, we can never truly rebuild what was lost. And we know this from the places who have already faced these catastrophic events and in the stories that you'll hear from our speakers tonight, and how these crises mean a loss of community, and with many people permanently displaced. And then for those who do return, it'll be to some place different. And they have collectively lost the places that grounded their sense of identity, home, safety, connection, and belonging. So let's just hold this and pause to take a collective breath. Thanks. So what does rebuilding and recovery mean in the face of this reality? There's the immediate aftermath and the long, long road ahead. And as we think about where we go from here, there are two guiding questions for us at OBI. First, what are we building toward? As hard as it is to imagine, especially amidst the very immediate suffering that's happening right now, that must be tended to, we need a shared vision for the future. And not just in 5 or 10 years, but a future for generations to come, because that's how long this work really takes. And so last year at OBI, we held a discussion similar to this one that was part of a series called Reimagining Urban Planning. And in this particular session, the question was about how we plan for dystopian futures. One of the speakers, Rachel Hatch, who's from the Institute for the Future, invited us to reframe the question on dystopia. And I want to bring her words in today. She said, let's not design for that dystopian future, but plan through that future. The critical task for all of us, actually, is to plan for the beautiful future, the just and joyful future, and to design the next thing, the thing that we mean to be living into. And of course, we can't ignore the present moment. The imperative is to hold both time horizons as we respond. And so the second question is, how does our shared vision of the future orient us to how we must take action now in a way that actually sets us on the right course toward that future? And what that vision for the future means will in many ways be unique to each community and their local context, but there's also this broader future that connects us all. And we also need to be thinking and planning at this level, not each community for itself, but a larger we, a region and a state, and of course, a global society. And not just planning for the places where people are displaced from, but in those that people will be displaced to. How do we collectively make sure that no community is left out of that future? And for me, this points to work that's needed not just when disaster strikes, but before that, now. And that isn't just a community by community strategy, but a shared fight and responsibility. This is especially true now, knowing that it's not a hyperbole to say that disasters are normal. These catastrophes are increasingly more frequent, more destructive, and closer to home, with widespread impacts that cascade beyond the places that are directly affected. And with each disaster, the impacts reveal the deep structural flaws in our economic, political, and social systems. So how do we navigate these structures to get us not only to the other side of the disaster, but to a better future? So when I introduce the speakers in a minute, you'll note that we are missing one of our speakers tonight. We were going to be joined by Colette Pichon-Battle, who is the co-founder of Taproot Earth, as well as the Gulf Coast Center on Law and Policy. And she's unable to be here due to a death in her family. While we're missing her critical perspective, I want to lift up some of her wisdom that speaks to these questions, which comes from her experience leading post-Katrina and post-Deepwater Horizon disaster recovery work around the Gulf Coast. Colette says, equitable recovery starts with repair. And these are her words that I'll paraphrase. The structures that exist have created imbalances, and in disaster, those discriminatory imbalances now equal aggregated impacts of vulnerabilities. And we've got to be able to see what history has created. And so equitable disaster recovery is about repair. It's not just about response, and our current disaster response system just doesn't take equity into consideration. So to survive the next phase of our human existence, we will need to restructure our social and economic systems to develop our collective resilience. The social restructuring must be toward restoration and repair of the earth and communities that have been extracted from, criminalized, and targeted for generations. We have to start at those places that we have created vulnerabilities in, and then go from there. And she says, we have enough resources to help everybody. This is about where we start. So this evening, we have three incredible speakers who, like Colette, have directly confronted the challenges of equitable disaster recovery as leaders in their communities and the field, and are here to share their insights and lessons learned, particularly around the question of where we must start when it comes to post-disaster recovery. So we'll hear from each of them, then move into a moderated discussion. But first, I'll start by introducing them. So first, we'll hear from Laurie Johnson, who is the founder and principal of Laurie Johnson Consulting. Laurie is an award-winning urban planner specializing in disaster recovery and catastrophe risk management. She has an extensive publication record and is the leading author of numerous government and industry guidance documents on disaster recovery and reconstruction, community and lifeline resilience, socioeconomic implications of catastrophes, and risk-informed land use planning. Over the years, she has developed an extensive portfolio of disaster risk reduction, recovery, and resilience expertise for an array of natural hazards, including earthquakes, landslides, floods, and hurricanes across the US and the world. And our next speaker will be Rémy De La Peza, who is the founder and principal of Morena Strategies. Rémy has nearly 20 years of experience as a community lawyer working on issues of land use, affordable housing, equitable community development, and gentrification at the local, state, and national level. She has led a number of successful community-driven public policy and site fight campaigns, was a co-founder of ACT LA, and currently serves on the board of directors for Inclusive Action for the City and the California Planning Roundtable. Rémy has been directly involved in Eaton fire recovery as a lifelong resident of Pasadena, now volunteering to lend her efforts, her professional and personal relationships and experiences to support in the fight against predatory speculation and for community-driven land stewardship. And last but not least, Jen Klose, who's the executive director of Generation Housing. Following a 15-year career as a real estate attorney, Jen transitioned to nonprofit leadership after playing a key role in her community's recovery from the 2017 wildfires. She became the founding executive director of Generation Housing, where she leads efforts to expand housing opportunities and improve quality of life across the North Bay. Jen served 2 terms on the Santa Rosa City Schools Board of Education, including 3 years as board president, during which the district navigated post-fire recovery and deep community trauma. She also co-chaired SoCo Rises, a grassroots disaster recovery coalition. At Generation Housing, she is committed to moving the needle on housing development on behalf of all North Bay residents. And after we have our presentations from our speakers, we'll have a moderated discussion led by Carolina Reed. And Carolina is the faculty research advisor for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, where she assists with the design and execution for the center's research agenda and portfolio. Carolina specializes in housing and community development with a specific focus on access to credit, housing and mortgage markets, affordable housing, and homelessness. So I will turn it over to Carolina.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you for those really amazing opening remarks, really thoughtful, and great to have a little bit of Colette in the room, so thank you. I also want to recognize Nicole's colleague, Eli Moore, who also helped us put this event together. I also want to just do a huge shout out to Evan White of the California Policy Lab, who is back there, who is the third formidable partner here in this collaboration. For those of you who aren't familiar with the California Policy Lab, they do incredible research on everything related to employment and homelessness and public services and making the government work better. And as part of this collaboration, we've been able to do really interesting projects on homelessness, on displacement, and now also looking at California's Dream for All program and measuring its impact. So thank you, Evan. I'm not going to stay up here for very long. In fact, I'm almost going to step down. I just wanted to make sure that we recognized Evan. I will also say that I am the understudy for tonight. We were supposed to be joined by our amazing research director, Sarah Karlinski. So you have me instead. I'm, thank you, Cara. I'm really delighted that you all came. I want to really thank Rajib and the Irvine Foundation for making this possible, for forcing us out of our silos, for getting to hear from different voices. And so with that, I'm going to invite Laurie to come up.
Thank you. It's so nice to see everybody here, and glad you made it out given the weather. I know it was challenging for some of us who had to drive across bridges to get here. So I was asked to actually give an opening talk that sort of reflects sort of best practice and knowledge on disaster recovery, but do it through the lens of one of the cases, one of the places where I've worked for over a decade, which is Christchurch, New Zealand. And that is a tough task to do in 10 minutes. I told Sarah I was going to probably run a few minutes late, but I'll try my best to whiz through this. So this is an image of Christchurch before the earthquake struck. 2010 was the first earthquake. There were a series of earthquakes. I'll talk more about it. But what I have up here is a quote actually by some of the first researchers that really did longitudinal studies of rebuilding after the 1906 earthquake, earthquakes in Managua, Nicaragua, a number of places all over the world. And their conclusion was one of their statements was, when disasters strike, there is already a plan for reconstruction indelibly stamped in the mind of every affected resident, the plan of the pre-disaster city. This is the first recovery plan, and all previous plans or new plans made following the disaster will undoubtedly compete for many residents with the first plan, oftentimes intensely. And that is really the tension between speed and deliberation that as a planner and recovery manager, I've spent my career sort of trying to undo and figure out how to work our way through that as best as possible. So let me tell you a little bit about Christchurch, and then we'll jump right into it. So Christchurch, anybody ever been to New Zealand? Anybody been to Christchurch? Well, it's a wonderful country, and their dollar is really cheap right now, so go if you can. And you'll have a wonderful time. So Christchurch is the largest metropolitan area on the South Island, and the second largest in New Zealand. New Zealand has a population now of about 5 million, and Christchurch has about 500,000 people in the urban area. The downtown looks exactly from a distance like Oakland's. Strangely, has several buildings that are about the same height, sort of the same shape and form. And you know, if you took Oakland out of the Bay Area, the economy and many things would be quite similar in their size. So New Zealand overall, just want to give this number, has a very small GDP, and this earthquake sequence was actually almost equal to a quarter of the national GDP. And that's a market for like World Bank and other entities that finance disaster recovery on a large scale, is really looking at the impact of the economic impacts per capita and on a country itself and whether it can finance recovery. The main economy is tourism, education, and agriculture. And New Zealand doesn't have states, so I probably won't say too much about this, but there's just national government and then local governments. But local is both regional and cities, and they all weave together to report to central government. So central government has a much stronger role in governance and oversight of local activities, including land use. So this is that downtown at the moment of the second earthquake, large earthquake. There were a number of aftershocks between the first one in 2010 and this one in February 22nd, 2011. It's roughly about 1 o'clock. It just happened that a woman lived up on this hilltop, had a camera poised at downtown. She takes pictures of the skyline regularly, and she caught this. That dust cloud that you see is the mortar that's been released from within concrete buildings across the downtown area. So the whole area is just shaking and rising up with dust. So it was very devastating. There were 185 deaths, which New Zealand has engineering practices on par with California. We actually trade people and best practice. So this was a very stunning level of death. And it mostly happened in 2 collapsed buildings, but also in a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings, something that we have been working very hard to get rid of in California. 100,000 damaged housing units. So as context, that's about 5 times the size of the number of damaged housing units in Los Angeles right now. So 225,000 households. So that's, now we're getting at almost roughly half the city has been directly impacted and damaged. They have a national insurance program for residential insurance. It covers the first loss. So the insurers sit behind for higher valued properties, but that national program had almost 500,000 claims. And they also subsidize land damage. So they actually repair the damage underneath the foundation. So I can't talk too much more about this stuff, but let me just say it was a very expensive disaster, and the national government knew it had to pay a lot, so it got very, very involved. So here's just some images of the area that had the land damages on the right, showing how it was the first earthquake. It was the smaller footprint. The second earthquake, it was larger, so a huge area was damaged. That's mostly residential area. There's a whole nother story about the downtown that I don't have time to tell you about, but let's just say everything was, as New Zealanders say, munted. So this is our book. This is one of the case studies in our book. My colleague, Rob Olshansky, a Berkeley grad, and I have been doing this work for 30 years. And as he was retiring, he wanted to sum it all up in our book, and you can get it for free, download at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policies called After Great Disasters. So we had some findings across all these countries and all these cases that we've looked at that will frame what I want to say for the rest of this sort of best practice stuff. First of all, we found that recovery really, when you looked at best practice, the governments that did well, the leaders who do well, they understand how to manage money, how to manage information. They use them both as commodities, and they also collaborate really, really well and do lots of it, and they know how to manage time. And I want to go back to thinking a lot about Nicole's comments about time. So finding and managing money, increasing the information flows to combat and basically enable all the recovery actors by leveling the playing field of information, which is a foundation for me of an equitable recovery. Supporting that collaboration and stakeholders when all new groups like Rémy's group arise, embrace these groups, see them as comrades in this effort, not as enemies, and then balancing time constraints. So why is time such an issue in recovery? Well, basically, disasters take out lots of capital stock and services all at once. So what a developer would do over a 5-year period to build a brand new structure, or we build cities in the way they look over a 50 or 100-year period, you now have to compress that rebuilding into a much shorter time frame. So that creates a whole bunch of issues. The place of disaster becomes different from other places. Things get out of sequence. Because you get money at different times from when you need it, or you're replacing, as they said in New Orleans, we're fixing the second floor before the first floor because their money for their foundations hadn't come in yet. So the disaster recovery process actually begins at the same time response does. Some people are already recovering as soon as the event is over. That's really true, like in the case of an earthquake, it's very sudden, it's very quick. Some can just, sweep up and move on. But recovery has different goals and activities in different phases. But it's basically a series of overlapping activities in time and space. And this is from those first researchers I talked about. They put this timeline together where they said that recovery could be this ordered, knowable process, which isn't true. It looks more like the other timeline. But what is true in their timeline is that every stage of recovery is incrementally harder and takes more time to achieve. So it's very easy to restore, or easier to restore things on a temporary basis than it is to repair them like for like, which is still easier than making change. So that's really where the challenge comes. If we want to make big changes post-disaster, we have to have things in place. We have to have policies in place ahead of time, or we have to do that collaboration and that money and that information and management of all of those things very successfully. My view on all of this is, for those who know about public engagement, is that you should just lay the public engagement spectrum, the public participation spectrum on top of this timeline and know that if you want change, you need to be doing the most active, empowering forms of public engagement. And if you're just replacing like for like, then you can post a notice and you can, take comments at a city council meeting, but really trying to push leaders to understand how much they have to do to really understand all of those interconnections that are now messed up because of time compression. So here's some images of the land damage to residential houses in Christchurch. And liquefaction was just phenomenal, something beyond anything we've seen anywhere else in the world. The government ended up buying out 7,000 houses in those damaged areas because of the repeated sequence of liquefaction. So they were responsible for repairing that damage, but every time they start to repair, another big earthquake would happen and they'd start over. That's something to think about right now as we watch the fires, as Malibu in particular and Palisades goes through the debris flows and the effects that rain are going to have in the area. So it essentially resets the clock. Some tasks you have to start over while other tasks are already way over here into the next phase. The lack of planning for this housing repair program and the buyout and all the workers who came to the region meant that housing prices went through the roof, both for sale and for rent. And for 2 years, basically, it was out of reach for most homes. The government was sued because of this, and they were forced to actually step in and do a land use recovery plan and open up more land for development. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but there really were a lot of great lessons, difficult lessons for us in terms of thinking about land use planning and housing recovery and policies and the timing of that relative to workforce housing and temporary housing needs that people have. Lastly, that aftershock sequence and also some flooding that they had essentially reset the clock, as I said, and that exacerbated the issues of differential recovery. And so this cartoon on the left is actually saying there's 4 tribes now in Christchurch. The people who didn't have anything happen to them, those who had enough money and it hasn't been a big deal, and the other people who are still struggling to rebuild. And then the statistics on the right are just enormous. This was 5 years after the earthquake, and you can see that 124% of emergency psychiatric assessments, so compared to before the earthquake, 25% increase in alcoholism, domestic abuse, and other statistics that are just 60% attempted suicide police call-outs, higher than before the earthquake. So it was devastating to the community. So recovery is always complex, never fast enough for affected residents, and we need to set realistic expectations at the outset. This is just a picture of people basically storming City Hall because they were so unhappy with how things were going. The other thing is that all the rebuilding that we've seen generally is done to higher standards because we're building at more modern codes generally. So most of our cases saw good science-driven, higher standards of rebuilding, but building back better often means that it takes longer. And risk perceptions change over time, and that's one of the biggest challenges in dealing with hazards in particular, is that how people feel about them today is not how they're going to feel about them a year from now if they don't have another fire in LA. And Sonoma went through this as well. And lastly, there is no clear endpoint to recovery. At some point, recovery policy is just subsumed by normal urban development policy. And what you see here is that there was an exodus of people to the outskirts of the city, while there was also an exodus of commercial activities to other places in the city. And so while they were rebuilding the transit system to be a hub center in the city of Christchurch downtown, everything had moved to the suburbs. And so this blogger on the right called Christchurch Future, it was a green apple, it's now a yellow banana. So now they're dealing with all sorts of new problems because things just aren't synced up right for the new land use patterns that they have. Lastly, good recovery management is asset-focused and people-focused. And unfortunately, mostly what we count and what we get paid for is to be asset-focused. And so a real challenge is how do we change our policies to be more people-focused and to center around the things that matter to people, besides the quantity and the timing and the standards and the cost. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Rémy De La Peza. I am here to talk about the Eaton Fire, which I imagine just because of the temporal proximity, you all may be a little bit more knowledgeable of, but just in case, I'm here to kind of set some grounding and foundation for our conversation. And as we get started, I'll talk a little bit more about my personal connection to the Eaton Fire. Okay. So for those who are not from Southern California, who I imagine most of you, Altadena is an unincorporated community of LA County. So LA County is made up of 88 incorporated cities and a plethora of little community pockets that are not incorporated, and Altadena is one of them. It's about an 8.5 square mile community just north of Pasadena, which may be more well known. And it's very interesting kind of in a geographic way because it is surrounded on 3 sides by open space and nature, with the Angeles National Forest to the north, the Arroyo Seco to the west, and Eaton Canyon, where the fire started, to the east. So just briefly, again, to orient all of you, who is Altadena? Kind of to Laurie's last point, my whole background is in a very people-centered approach, and so to me, the people come first before we talk about what was lost or what was there by way of structures. So first, a little kudos to the Lewis Center from UCLA. Most of this chart is pulled from some analysis they did in February. And just as a disclaimer to help you understand the columns, the Eaton Fire, right, fires know no jurisdictional bounds, covered Altadena, which was the biggest swath, again, unincorporated, LA County, a little bit of the city of Pasadena, a little bit of the city of Sierra Madre, and another even smaller unincorporated area known as Kinaloa. And so the Eaton Fire perimeter is kind of data related to that entire community that was affected. The Altadena Eaton column is 3 census tracts combined that really represent Altadena, but not perfectly. So really just sharing this more as representation and not for exact numbers for you all. But what I want to highlight here when it comes to who was Altadena, and again, when I'm talking about the Eaton Fire, I'm going to be mostly focused on Altadena and the impacts there, is the notable significant Black population, the relative ethnic diversity of Altadena, the high homeownership rate in an otherwise majority renter county. LA County is majority renter. You could see here quite staggering homeownership rate in Altadena. And then when you disaggregate that and look at the Black population and the Latino population of Altadena, those residents had even very significant high homeownership rates. And I also want to flag, not on this slide, but that the majority of Black homeowners in Altadena are also over the age of 65. It's a very senior population in this area. So I can also talk, maybe it'll come up later, about the housing stock in the area and kind of what the housing looked like. But again, I prefer to focus on the people, so I'm gonna leave it there. And for the sake of time, just keep it moving on the damage. So again, we lost 17 people in this fire, which is tragic when you really hear the stories of what happened to individuals who died in the fire. As you know, this started January 7th, 2025, and was active for 24 days as a result of the very intense winds we experienced. Tons of residents under evacuation orders. Many folks are just now moving back for those who have not lost their homes, but because of smoke damage, I have a number of friends who are either still displaced or are just now finally getting to move back home. We are doing a bunch of data crunching and research, but estimates are around 6,000 homes probably lost. Again, this is the Eaton Fire piece of the larger LA fires when we disaggregate from Palisades. And a number of historic places and places of community and gathering, including a mosque and Jewish temple and multiple churches, The big multiple parks in the area also burned. So this is, again, not quite at a human scale of what the tragedy looks like, but just to give you a quick snapshot. Okay, so why am I here talking to all of you? Like Rajib, I flew up earlier today, and I unfortunately have to catch the last flight back to Burbank, so I can't stick around. But this is the only picture I took from my house. I am a lifelong resident of Pasadena. I live in North Pasadena, and this was at 6:51 p.m. when the winds were insane, and I looked outside and could see that there was a fire very, very close and smoke. It's a blurry picture because I was shaking, and shortly after this, I evacuated. So this is extremely personal. I'm so fortunate to still have my home, but I have countless friends and colleagues who have lost everything. And it is devastating to drive down the street every day and see all of these places that hold community together completely gone. And so my work, or volunteer work, I should say, I am not a disaster specialist like Laurie. I am a community-based land use attorney. My whole career has been predominantly in place-based community development, where I am embedded in communities of color, communities that have been redlined and historically disinvested in, and I bring my legal background to the bigger toolbox of tools to say, you all know what's best for your neighborhoods. What do you need? What do you want? And where can the law be one of those levers? And I'm here to help, but I get to work in coalitions and collaboratives with advocates and community organizers and tons of people who know a bunch of stuff about things I don't know. And often the law, surprise, surprise, is not the most effective tool. So that's kind of who I was pre-fire. And because of that work, and because of my residency in Pasadena and my deep roots, I have been playing a few roles organically thrust into recovery efforts. And one I would say is a connector. I am playing kind of this connector role between folks on the ground, people who have lost everything, the civic institutions and community organizations, the organizers, and the people who are further removed, whether that be at government, whether that be allies and partners outside of Altadena and Pasadena who want to help, and whether that be expertise in kind of community development and land use. And so that has been a huge piece of my job, is helping people meet each other and talk to each other. The other piece is really around identifying specifically anti-speculation strategies. Again, given my background, that's sort of where I'm thrusting myself in the most, is urgent strategies to support the community from speculative investors. And then lastly, I'm also involved in some research that's doing a deeper dive on disaster speculation and capitalism and the vulnerability of Altadena to speculation. So that's me, and I know I don't have much time, so I'm just gonna quickly, we were asked to talk briefly about challenges and what's working well. I think we'll unpack that a lot more in the conversation, but I just wanna briefly lift up probably the biggest challenges, again, just from my perspective in this recovery space, has been already some of the things that were already uplifted by Laurie. The transition from the urgent reactivity and the influx of resources and people and thoughts and communication to now moving into more organized, coordinated work. What I'm calling big P politics and little p politics, which is the interjurisdictional government piece and the actual politicians, but also community politics. Anyone who works in community knows we got our own sets of issues when it comes to community politics. So those things are in full force right now. And again, as was mentioned, the tension between how do we let community drive what the recovery looks like and listen, but also how do we move quickly when that community is suffering and traumatized and trying to find a place to live right now. On the positive side, what's working well? So I'm gonna try not to cry. The love for Altadena within Altadena and without is so incredibly immense and beautiful. And you feel it and you see it every day. And that is, I think, what's keeping so many of us from falling apart right now. The next two kind of go hand in hand. I've been really inspired by how community can be fast acting and move and be nimble and do things while government is not quite ready to go there yet. And I think some of this is a real testament to the social infrastructure that was built out after the pandemic. And then lastly, we are realizing how much knowledge exists within our community and again with kind of surrounding Altadena, whether it's expertise in real estate, in previous disasters on the finance and capital side, but also the immense kind of caretaking knowledge and ability to hold healing for each other that already exists in Altadenans. So these are the things that I think most prevalently are showing up as beautiful aspects of recovery. But I'm really excited to hear more from Jen and learn from both of these other panelists and talk to you all a little bit more next. So Jesse, I'm sorry if I went overboard.
Thank you. I'm Jen Klose, Executive Director of Generation Housing, 5 years young, housing advocacy organization that was born from the recovery of the 2017 wildfires. And I'm going to go totally off script and just say that I spoke at the California School Board Association event about a year after the fires, talking about our recovery and what we did on the school board and in the administration on that level. And a woman came up to me and to the superintendent, and she introduced herself, and she said, I was on the school board in Laguna at the fires there, and how damaging that was to the community and how important the schools were to the fabric of the community. And while she was talking about that, she just started to cry. And those fires, I'm fairly certain, were mid-90s. And I looked at Diane, the superintendent there, and I said, we're in for it. Like, this is, and so like watching Rémy, who's in the thick of it right now, and it brings it right back because these are super traumatic events. Okay, at the time of the fires, I was a practicing lawyer, and not this kind of lawyer, but a sort of uninspired real estate practice lawyer. And I happened to be the school board president of Santa Rosa City Schools, which was the most impacted district by the fires, the biggest district in Sonoma County. And on that single night in Santa Rosa, when we lost 5% of our housing stock, 800 students lost their homes and 100 staff members lost their homes. We lost a school, and by the end of the week of burning, about 75% of our school population, that family, had been evacuated from their homes. 2 of my school board colleagues lost their homes that night as well. And being the school board president all of a sudden became a full-time job. Although I can't explain what I did all day. And it sat me at a lot of tables instantly that were talking about long-term recovery. And those meetings, they framed disaster, okay. Similarly, everyone uses different words, but it's kind of the same concepts, but into 3 phases: relief, that immediately, the immediate relief; rebuild, what we have lost; and then recover, the long-term recovery. And while the fires were still burning and relief and the start of rebuild were kind of in hand by the folks who were in charge of that, many of us had already started looking at the long-term recovery. SoCo Rises, which was mentioned in my bio, was a nonprofit kind of quickly launched that was focused on putting equity at the center of our long-term recovery. And that organization coined the phrase, the Saturday problems. See, our fire happened on a Sunday, and we said if we were going to rebuild better, if we were going to rebuild more equitably, that we had to make sure that our long-term recovery addressed the Saturday problems, the things that existed before and were exacerbated by the fires. I haven't yet learned how to use notes on the PowerPoint, but on day 3 of the fires, And I wish I had this, but it would probably violate all kinds of privacy laws. The district admin showed me a GIS map on the big screen in our district conference room of our student body overlaid with the fire and evac zones. And of course, it showed the homes that had been lost and the families that had been impacted in that way. But the other thing that it showed me that I kind of knew intellectually, but I'd never really gotten my head around till I saw it on the screen, was how many of our student families were doubled and tripled up in homes. And that was shocking. And it's an image that has stayed with me since and motivated me to take this job and motivates me every day in the job. Our local community foundation, Sonoma County, very wisely dedicated a lot of its resilience fund to medium and long-term recovery, and that included researching the solutions to our pre-existing housing crisis, and that led them to become the launching funder for a new local housing advocacy organization, which became Generation Housing. And Gen H, that's Generation Housing for short, we operate on the belief that we can't tackle this housing crisis as like a handful of housing wonks, no offense, housing wonks, who predictably show up at public meetings saying the same thing all the time, but that had to be a big cross-sector, big tent coalition. I am not a housing expert, and nor am I a disaster recovery expert. I'm not sure why I'm here, in fact. But our work falls into 4 buckets. The Sonoma County development math is super challenging. It costs almost as much to build there as it does in San Francisco, but rents are not as high, not even close. Now, that doesn't mean that our folks are living super well. Cost of living is high and wages are really low, but it is hard to get things to pencil. It's hard everywhere in California. I know you all know that, but it's super hard in Sonoma County. So we work in partnership to try to find solutions to that. We endorse and advocate for projects, and after about 5 years of this, I wouldn't give any NIMBY effort a fighting chance against us. And we advocate for pro-housing policy a little bit at the federal level, a little bit at the state level, more and more on the local level. We've had some really big local policy wins lately, and I think that, after this, our 5 years in this, we have just now gained the momentum and the respect and sort of the political power in order to be poised for more and more wins. And then the 4th bucket is overarching, and that's because we can't get any of that other work done without it, and that's our public and political will building, sort of our original charge. And we ground our public and political will building work in humanizing housing. You will find very few of our images and less of our language, honestly, talking about housing units and construction. In fact, I think the only building in our images is the one of the construction worker. Instead, when we talk about need, we talk about people. And we try to destigmatize affordable housing and the people who need it. We make it really clear that it's not just for people who are exiting out of homelessness or living on the margins or our lowest wage workers, but it's our friends and our families and the people we depend on every day and the people we missed in the dependent, those essential workers, and the people who really just make our community whole and vibrant. And when we talk about solutions, we really ground our talk about intersectionality and about how things work together. We need everyone to see them in the world of solutions. And honestly, some people also actually don't care about the people. They want to know how it all fits together. So we talk about how improving our housing system improves educational and economic and environmental and health outcomes, benefiting everyone in the community. And you will see that this adorable cartoon version of Sonoma County looks a lot like where we live, but not close enough that anyone can say, that's my neighborhood. You can't put an apartment building there. So that's pretty intentional. In our first few months, Gen H led the effort to make sure that Sonoma and Napa and Butte got our fair share of wildfire disaster tax credits instead of them being redirected to larger and less impacted areas. But after that, local policy and practices with respect to rebuild really predate us, and we're not in our lane, but still I want to do a little top line overview of the outcomes of our actual rebuild of units lost. So in Sonoma County, unincorporated Sonoma County, about 2,000 parcels were impacted. 82% of the dwelling units were rebuilt. Now, these are hard to track, but from what we know from anecdotal information is that most of the people who built, and this is sort of in the country, in the WUI and further out, actually chose not to rebuild. They chose to live in places that were less impacted by these kind of risks, and that's probably a good thing. In Santa Rosa, the city of Santa Rosa, we built 106% of units. What does that even mean, and how did we do that? And it means, to put kind of a finer point on it, first of all, it's a result of the resilient city ordinances that were passed very soon after the fires. We built more ADUs. And I say permitted because not all of these are built yet, but this is what we know absolutely for sure, but most are built. We built more multifamily units than we had before on the same parcels. And we built fewer units than, I'm definitely gonna go a couple minutes over. And we built, blame it on the off script. And we built fewer units in wildfire risk WUI areas. So also a good thing. This was good policy. This was, in fact, Governor Newsom praised us in his 2019 State of the State address. So this is the result of good policy. Now, how did we do in long-term recovery, or so far, right? That's harder. So this is Santa Rosa production over 40 years. And you'll see that we have built more in these last few years since the fires. But you know, to be fair, the decade before was after the Great Recession. And if you look, the purple is all rebuild. So in terms of recovery, are we building more units, the units that we needed before? And our research says we actually are short 58,000 units going on 2030, or 28 or 38,000 behind right now. So we need a lot to build. We haven't built a ton more, and some of that big tall line is actually a result of one-time disaster relief funds, and so it doesn't necessarily indicate a trend. The other thing is that when you put this black line across, which is the average over 40 years, you'll see that we're still pretty much underperforming average, and average is what got us in this housing crisis. How do we compare overall as a county to other places? And these are some jurisdictions that we chose because they're similar one way or another. And when you include fire rebuilds, our production rates look pretty good. And when you take out the fire rebuilds, they are still looking pretty anemic. And that's even when people are, you know, so focused on housing recovery. So do we have Sonoma County people in here, by the way? Anybody? I just wanted to know how much of a safe space I'm in right now. Okay, so we are not doing super well at this. And looking at the data another way, actually, we are on task right now to underperform the decade following the Great Recession. So it is concerning. But I would like to speak in our defense a little bit. And this is a chart that many of you might have seen, or some version of this chart, and it's sometimes called phases of collective trauma response or community sentiment, but it shows this, you know, this thing, the feelings of the community after disaster. And there's this heroic, or there's a sudden impact, you know, that's the disaster, the fires. Then there's a heroic phase, and that's when you have the signs, Altadena together, and hashtag Sonoma strong, hashtag Santa Rosa strong. And then the disillusionment phase, when people are, you know, not as all in this together, and they've lost jobs and they've lost faith. And this was a period of time when, even though we thought we'd pass it, Santa Rosa's housing bond went on the ballot, and we Measure N, and we lost just a year after the fires. And it lost because at the last minute there was a mounted opposition by folks who basically didn't get their way in the, they didn't get the concessions they wanted as we were drafting the language for that bond. And so they opposed it, and it fell. So we are definitely not all in it together anymore. That is part of the chart. So then after that, there's this period of rebuilding and restoration, and lots of communities are stronger afterwards because of the investment and because of this period. But here's what happened here in Sonoma County. So we had the 2017 wildfires. A year later were the campfires in Paradise, where the smoke settled so thick in Sonoma County, we had to basically shut down schools and governmental services for a few years. And there was sort of a collective re-triggering. Soon after that, we had a flood, and these are all declared disasters, by the way. Then the Kincaid fire, where about a third of our county was evacuated. Then, of course, the pandemic shut down, followed by the LNU complex lightning fires and the glass fire. So these are the disasters, declared disasters, that we've suffered since our original disaster. This chart, by the way, is totally not scientific. We made it with Canva. It's like vibe science. But it's common sense, right? You know, the heroic phase, we're getting less heroic each time, and we're being more disillusioned each time, and we're being distracted each time. And I think Laurie said something about successive plans. Like, how many plans happened during this period of time? Or how many times did we have to resist a new plan? So that was hard, and it's been hard. Part of the problem too is that our leadership at the elected level, at the appointed level, at the staff level, they're not just beaten down, but they're just distracted every time that this happens. And, they not only have the disaster du jour, but they have to deal with the normal stuff, regular life of jurisdictional management. So recovery is just long and hard. And it's not a straight line ever, even if there's just one disaster, but it really hasn't been for us. Every community that's hit with disaster has its Saturday problems. And in California, it most likely includes a housing crisis. And even without repeated disasters, jurisdictional leadership gets weary and leadership changes, and people can get distracted by managing the day-to-day. And the solutions vary from town to town, even the 10 jurisdictions within Sonoma County. But what we learned in Sonoma County may or may not be applicable in Altadena or in Paradise or the Palisades. It could all be different. But here's what I think is consistent, is that the people who are going to drive long-term recovery are the people who live there. They're the people who are dedicated to that community. They are the people who are passionate about that community. They are the people. It is not outside consultants or prepackaged programs. It is not going to be just take a cut and paste advice from some other community. And don't get me wrong, you need expertise, you need experts, you need to learn from other communities. We hired Laurie Johnson, and everyone should hire Laurie Johnson, but when the disaster money flows in, a significant amount of money needs to go into increasing the knowledge base, the skills, the capacity of local organizations, so that they can keep pursuing the long-term goals and hold jurisdictional leadership accountable to the long-term recovery plans, to addressing those Saturday problems when they are distracted by all else. And specific to housing, there needs to be some organization like ours, whether it's new or existing, that is well supported and well empowered to do the research and the policy work that the jurisdictions don't have time to do the education, the coalition building, the public and political will building, and specific advocacy to keep leaders' attention on long-term housing goals and strategies, and to combat the NIMBYs and naysayers who existed before, and now they've got new arguments. There has to be a durable, sustainable, independent leadership that is singling and relentlessly focused on tackling Saturday's housing problems. Thanks.
So thank you for those 3 amazing presentations. We are going to do a little bit of Q&A and then hopefully open that up to the audience for some of your questions, so think about your questions. I'm going to jump ahead of my assigned script because I think the biggest challenge that I heard in all of your presentations is the challenge between the urgency of rebuilding and who had power prior to the rebuilding, right? The Saturday problems, or what Colette said, right? The structural factors that led to these uneven landscapes and uneven impacts. The resources that you need and the urgency of getting those resources, and also imagining a different future and making sure that you are rebuilding in a more equitable way. And it seems to me that that is what planning is about and what good governance is about. And so what I'd like to hear from each of you is, what does that look like, either in places that you are working, have worked, and what are you thinking about as being the most important elements for Altadena going forward? Or what are the things that you're most worried about? And maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I come from a like very grassroots community planning background and have worked in communities not related to a disaster, but that were in community-driven planning processes, either on their own or because it was connected to municipal, formal, community plans, general plan related plans. And Altadena the city, or the county just adopted yesterday an area plan that includes Altadena, and so there's updated formal like land use and zoning. None of that reflects what we just went through, right? All of the engagement that happened years ago. The last community plan for the area was in '86, so this update is a long time coming, but it is not necessarily going to be responsive to the needs of what just happened. And so we are really concerned about working with the county and the planning department as they embark on their capital improvements plan, which will be the money side of things and infrastructure. Luckily, we have some great partners in the planning side. But I will say, I think there is still a lack of communication and collaboration and real listening and even real knowing of who is on the ground from our supervisor. The county is massive. Her district is massive. Altadena is a drop in her bucket. And so there is kind of this real tension there around the hyper-focus that Altadena is needing right now and the lack of governmental infrastructure in the space. And then again, when it comes to community engaging and planning, we didn't have and we don't have a place-based CDC. We don't have an existing Gen H kind of organization. And so we are in the throes right now of figuring out who can serve as that kind of hub and that anchor institution that is trusted by and that is formed by community. We have a lot of folks from outside who want to be that, and we are navigating that piece. So I think the real concern is moving from this rebuild or this, what was the restore piece? Is that on your slide, Jen, number one? Relief. Okay. So like that initial phase into now thinking towards the future, like how do we do that? How do we manage the people side of that? And how do we do that in the midst of government and outside community entities all kind of jockeying for position? So I'll just leave it there. All right.
I'll try to keep it brief. I think one of the first research projects we did was looking at the role of plans and planning. And so kind of now talking more about governance and management is really an evolution in our work. But when we go back at the beginning, what we've seen consistently, even now, is that communities that have up-to-date plans generally do better. In California, we may be frustrated with a lot of things, but because we have requirements to have a safety element in our plans, and if those things are kept up to date, then generally there's some decent information going into events that, many places I've worked, like New Orleans, they had not updated their plan in 30 years when Katrina hit them. And they had a plan that was, still in the midst of the oil boom. And that was not the city, and, for many years before Katrina hit. And so we really started from scratch. So you can have, I guess, my view is you can have speed and quality plans in place and good governance and a government knowing its community and a community knowing its plans and knowing where they're off, knowing a community coming to a realization about housing after an event, is what we want to avoid, right? And so that's where, I think organizations can help with that, plan processes, community engagement can help with that. But that's why I also really try to urge governments to start a planning process after an event. You don't have to call it a planning process, you can just call it an engagement process. But number one, it helps with grief. It helps people come together. It gives an organizing effect, and I know SoCo Rise did a lot of that. And it also begins to vet issues. You surface issues. And that time compression thing is so real that so many things are interconnected and they're so tightly connected and dependent on each other and affected by decisions that are made in the aftermath of the disaster because the systems are so perturbed. So everything's just like, think about it like when you're stressed out. It's like that, like the environment All of our different economic, social, physical, natural systems are all perturbed. So if you can start that planning process and engage with people, you're more likely to surface issues that like Christchurch didn't see with their housing situation, because they just didn't realize workers would be coming in at the same time people were starting repairs and out of their homes, at the same time they bought out 7,000 houses, and those people were on the street. So that's where I think a good government approach is to really start engaging with the community as quickly as possible.
Great. And Jen, you are definitely talking most about like sort of the housing, and I think everybody in this room knows that the housing crisis existed well before any of the disasters we've seen, from flooding to fires. How does this exacerbate? How do crises like this exacerbate? And what is the potential to move forward after disaster in both building enough housing, but then also building it in an equitable way, thinking about both homeowners, thinking about low-income households, thinking about renters?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, like Laurie said, it's not ideal to realize you have a housing crisis after a disaster like that. And it's not like it was news necessarily, but there wasn't the attention on the crisis prior to the disaster. And in that way, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity because there was this attention because, like I said, 5% of our largest cities' housing stock was lost in a single night. There were almost 6,000 housing units lost overall. That's significant. But for the first time, everybody was talking about it. It wasn't, the small housing advocacy organization that had existed for years and not gotten much done. It was everybody across sector in every room called by anyone about anything. We would end up talking about housing, and that's still the case. And so there's some opportunity there. I think, and there's been opportunity to talk with the finer point about what that means and really look at how our housing is inequitable in our community and what are the policies to make it better. Some of the challenges to actually acting on that desire and on that information is that we also have been doing this work in the face of all of these repeat disasters. And also the other disaster that's sort of overarching that's not on there is the interest rate environment disaster. And when we're talking about building housing, that is a crisis and a disaster. Add that to the materials cost, and it's been really hard to build housing. So even where there's been some policy advantages and and some policy progress, there hasn't been the same kind of outcome that you would think. But it is also, there's a trickle down when we lose houses. There were people who, similar to what happened in LA, where there was the Palisades in Altadena. In Sonoma County, there was Fountain Grove and Coffee Park, and we had folks who were very wealthy, and then working class folks, and then we have the rest of the city. And people in Fountain Grove often had second homes that they used as rentals, and so they, by their right, they had every right to do this. They said to their tenants, "We're going to need to move into our rental home," and gave them notice to move somewhere else. And so now, after having lost all that housing stock, we also had a whole lot of people with a low vacancy rate going into this who were looking for housing who didn't necessarily have money saved up. So there's a kind of a trickle down to the loss. And while there is an opportunity to talk about more equitable rebuild, making that practical is really hard.
Can you talk a little bit about how you managed to increase the number of ADUs, increase the number of multifamily buildings on presumably what before were single-family lots? Was that decisions of individual property owners? Was that a policy? What helped that happen?
Yeah, Santa Rosa's Resilient City Ordinance gave ministerial rights to build ADUs. It took away almost all fees before the state of California did the same, and without necessarily affordability requirements for people to build ADUs. It did all kinds of things to incentivize multifamily housing on the same parcels. It allowed for legal non-conforming units to just rebuild by right in the way they had existed before. All of these things that incentivized those units, but it was a one-stop shop. And the city council approved that, But I think it is really important to recognize how critical or how game-changing the right person in the right place can be. Because we had an assistant city manager who in Sonoma County is almost seen as sort of like a saint for his efforts after the fire. And he really said, let's try everything. And let's try everything really quickly. And we'll see if it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But let's try everything. And he really brought a level of passion to it that got everyone on board behind him. And that wasn't necessarily the case at the county level. They were a little bit less bold, they were a little bit slower, and so that's one reason Santa Rosa, I think, saw such a big rebuild. But so it was good policy, but it was driven by a person who was really bold in his leadership.
Great, thank you. Rémy, you were starting by saying, like, I wasn't even doing this before. I was helping groups try and think about, could they develop community land trust strategies or other ways of anti-speculative land use. How do you see that fitting in your rebuild?
Yeah, it's very relevant, as I've come to learn. Again, with the disaster seasoning on it, which I hadn't quite had before. But yeah, most of my practice was very much in like what we would say like anti-gentrification world. And so much of that is around displacement, and in today's housing economy, the commodification of housing and how corporate ownership is really on the rise, and how at the end of the day people are suffering because there isn't housing. Not only is there not enough, there isn't affordable housing that's available and accessible to the people who need it the most, right? And so looking at policy solutions and community-led strategies like a land trust, which is really about decommodification of housing and permanent affordability, as well as land banking, which is about like quickly acquiring land and holding it, not to keep it forever, but to steward that land to its final destination, whether that be a land trust or that be individual homeowners or cooperatives that get formed by renters who want to engage in some sort of shared ownership structure. And so all of those strategies are things that we are now exploring and talking to community about in the Eaton Fire Altadena recovery area. I will just highlight one in particular. In this very immediate, urgent space, the concerns of speculation are real, and a lot of folks cannot stay on their land. They are overwhelmed, and I have so many questions for both of you about like, how did you pay for it and everything? Because right, that's where we're running up against the numbers, and people are like, we cannot afford to stay and rebuild. We love this community, but especially if they're 70, 75 years old, is this the way they want to spend their next 5, 10 years? And so without judgment, really giving community members an option. If you need to sell, can we have a community acquisition strategy for you where you can sell to a community entity who you can trust will hold it, steward it for the future while we all figure out what we're doing and we come up with our plan. We don't know yet where it's going to end up, but don't sell to private speculators and to corporations. And this is where community has proven to be nimble, and we had an existing homeownership organization, Pasadena resident who founded the organization Green Line Housing Foundation. She just happens to be a licensed realtor. She happens to have an LLC already in existence as part of her nonprofit structure for her organization, was doing homebuyer assistance, and put her hand up and said, I'll do it. We can't wait any longer. We'll figure this out. To your point, a human being who was just like, we'll just try. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but we got to try something. And so we have been supporting Green Line in getting capital. They had their first acquisition close, I believe, last week or a week and a half ago, and saved at least one property. There's multiple landowners who have approached her and are concerned and are thinking about also needing to sell. So that's just one example. Again, I don't want to take up all the air in the room, but the intersection of my pre-fire existence and now post-fire are definitely coming together.
Great, thank you. Laurie, could you maybe share, like, what do you think are the 3 best strategies for renters and homeowners in these situations, right? What have we learned from past disasters about how to really make sure both of those groups are part of an equitable recovery?
It's working. So our disaster management or our disaster relief structure in the United States, the Stafford Act sort of being at the top of it federally, is really built around a single family house. It's built around a Florida hurricane, I'll be honest. And so it's the idea that we're insured, we're taking care of ourselves, we're living in single family houses. So we really don't have good policies or programs for multifamily housing. We don't understand people who are renters very well in our policy structure. In our policy structure, we have HCD is here today. Community Development Block Grants. That program within HUD has been the life saver and the workhorse of making equitable housing recovery after disasters. It was very rarely, it was not used. There was just a small clause in the CDBG Act that talked about you could use CDBG for disaster recovery. It was used for some of the first time in the late 90s, and in Northridge was really the first time it got big visibility, the Northridge earthquake in LA. And it was really the city of LA's housing department that got together a repair program with loans, no interest loans funded by CDBG money to repair all the damaged multifamily housing in the Northridge earthquake, which was tremendous. But there was those apartment owners were mom and pops. They weren't corporations at the time, and they were worried about the corporate takeover, which did happen. I forget the name of it. And there's a funny story I'll tell you about that guy. But they took advantage of the program, but they rebuilt within 5 years, all the multifamily housing was repaired. But we really don't, in this, like in the fires in this case, I don't know if we don't get that congressional appropriation. It has to be a second thing that Congress does to approve CDBG money. It doesn't come with a presidential disaster declaration. So if that doesn't come for LA, then the housing challenges are going to be immense. Fires generally have been better insured events than, let's say, earthquakes in California. So there is a lot of money. There's a lot of pent-up readiness to rebuild for a lot of people, but there's a lot of people who didn't have insurance because they're generational homeowners. They are underinsured because they hadn't kept up with it or couldn't afford it. I've met so many people now, even in Sonoma County, that are only insuring to the level of their mortgage because that's all their lender is requiring them to do. So you can't rebuild your house, unless you have that full coverage. Prices always go up after disasters. So I can't say that I have a best practice to offer. I think we do pretty good on single family housing. We suck at multifamily housing recovery.
Great. I would like to open it up to the audience. We don't have a ton of time, so please, I know we all have personal stories that we want to share, but let's focus on a quick question, and maybe I'll take 3 quick questions, and then the panel can address all 3. Colleen here. Sorry, Colleen, to make you run. Nope, stop, left, right.
I have a question, regarding, if you look at this FEMA national plans, and the guidelines that they have like household preparedness guidelines, and then they have, community-based disaster management guidelines. I'm just wondering that how does it really translate from, the national level guidelines to the state level, California, and then, like county level, and how does it impact the community-based disaster risk management and household level planning?
Great. Let's take a couple others. Just Lizzie?
I'm just wondering, at this early stage of rebuilding, Remy, what do you need from banks and other community development lenders?
And we'll take one more there in the back. Let's do Evan, actually. Let's give Evan a chance. Raise your hand again, Evan.
I just was wondering about the who you're rebuilding for. So everybody talks like a big focus on people, but I imagine a lot of folks have to leave. They can't sit around and wait for their house to be rebuilt for 2-3 years. Construction costs are going to go up. Are we really rebuilding for the folks who are actually affected by the disaster? And how do you think about that short term, Rémy, and how are you guys thinking about that after the experience of long term looking back?
Great. Do you want to maybe take the FEMA one to start?
One. So it depends. It depends on the guideline, and it depends on the state, and it depends on the locality. In California, we work okay with FEMA. We have a very robust emergency management structure in California. We've learned the hard way. We have lots of disasters. We have adopted a lot of the national policy is adopted at the state level. So right now, and again, Clay could talk about this a little bit more, but right now, our state recovery structure is working together with the federal recovery structure that's all laid out in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And they're working hard to develop a recovery needs assessment and then try to see what federal and state agencies can help fill these gaps and also make an ask to Congress. It's basically the ammunition for Congress people to develop that ask. But things around preparedness, and those are aspirational, I would say, for the most part. It really depends what FEMA mandates and attaches strings to funding for. So hazard mitigation plans, a jurisdiction that doesn't have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan may not get a higher match of their post-disaster hazard mitigation dollars. They may have to pay more. So there's a connection there on that particular piece of FEMA policy and guidance, but like recovery planning is not mandated. The National Incident Management System is. California has its own version, and we get along. The two systems talk, but everything is sort of different. I think some things are aspirational, some are actually got more teeth to them.
Jen, could you maybe talk about who moved back to Santa Rosa, right? Like, did you build for the people who were there?
Yeah, I think, Santa Rosa and Sonoma County altogether are unique in that we have very little multifamily housing. It's a problem. We don't have many housing typologies. It's almost all single-family homes, and most of the homes that were lost in the fires were single-family homes. I don't have the percentage for you now, although I can get it at least for Santa Rosa, but most people rebuilt their homes for themselves. The great majority of them rebuilt for themselves. Some people rebuilt and sold. Some people did leave, and we did see. We saw a decline in population for the first time in decades, and that decline is continuing. And you might have read in the papers that we recently had to close many schools because of that population decline. That's been significant. But most of the actual rebuild of the fire loss was for the folks who lost their homes directly in the fire. And then as we look at long-term recovery, we are trying to build for the folks that I saw on that map who are doubled and tripled up in homes, the folks who are working there but commuting from other counties, the people that we are underserving as a community to make a stronger housing system for everybody.
All right, money. What can banks and community development lenders do?
Yeah, first, ask that question, please. So thank you for asking that. You'd be surprised how many, or maybe you wouldn't, how many people come in and just tell us what they're gonna do for us. So I would say, first of all, come and ask, what do you need? It's changing day to day, and I imagine that's gonna be the case for a while. The second piece, and again, this is not just for lenders, but I think especially for lenders for philanthropy, folks with the capital, please work together with your folks. Maybe that's not how you normally do things in a competitive market, but we really need to not have 15 different lenders all approaching and saying, we're gonna do this one thing for you. We need you all to come together and pool your money. And I do think there's very specific needs at different stages. Clearly, in this urgent space, as I mentioned, the land acquisition piece is enormous. We're talking about obviously millions of dollars in a high-cost area when you're looking at acquiring land. I get that that's scary. I get that there's risk involved with remediation and all of the liabilities that we're all trying to figure out right now. But if we don't do something, it'll be gone, and it'll be gone forever. So I'm lucky to have some local folks in the CDFI space who are creative and who want to work with philanthropy and with banks to find capital and think of different structured funds and different ways of leveraging the different sources and what each can offer in some new and creative ways to actually meet the needs right now. So I think thinking outside of the box and being willing, especially our mission-based CDFIs, like this is the time to show that you actually have a mission. So I'm calling you to prove that to us.
So you have to leave right at 7:05? Yeah. All right. I'm going to then call it because I don't want you to miss your plane. Could you please all join me in thanking this amazing panel? And I also want to do just a quick thanks to Jesse and Brandy and Sheila and Chris and Colleen and the rest of the amazing Terner staff who helped put this together. Thank you all for joining us, and yeah, come back to the next thing.
A quick announcement. As you're gathering your things, if you've lost your phone, we have it for you at the check-in table. So you might want to just confirm that you have your cell phone, please. Thank you.
And please return your name tags to the check-in table. Thank you all so much for coming.